Corrine's first introduction into the world of antiques was at an antique jewelry shop in Burlington Arcade, London, where she worked part-time while a student at the University College, London. It was an amazing experience that stimulated a lifelong interest in antiques and their history, and particularly antique jewelry. She married a jeweler, Jeff Saunders, and that allowed her to pursue that interest, and she eventually opened an antique shop outside of Johannesburg, South Africa. 43 years later, they moved to Canada to join their daughter Erica, and they handed their business over to her. Corrine still pursues her love of antiques and jewelry with her husband and daughter in the family business La Vogue Vintage. Please join me in welcoming Corrine Saunders.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to share a little bit. No, I think I need to rephrase that. My little bit of knowledge of silver with you this evening. Before I get involved in the actual presentation itself, I have to say it was such a big subject to fit into 20 to 25 minutes. In fact, it was an impossible situation. So I'm calling what I'm going to say to you this evening Part 1. And if you enjoy it, and the committee so desires, I might be invited back to give you Part 2. I've titled the presentation Old English Silver, because I am English, so naturally that's what I know most about, but also its importance in history. And silver was important, politically, economically, and of course decoratively. On the screen at the moment is a picture of 2 sterling silver chocolate pots from the Queen Anne period. The one on the left was made in London in 1712, and the one on the right was made in Dublin in 1706. So, simple calculation, they are both over 400 years old, and they are absolutely amazing. For me, this is what high quality English silver is all about. Plain, simple, elegant. The proportions are amazing. The flow, that's beautiful. They're 2 different ones, so they're 2 beautiful slims, pouring spouts. Wooden handles with detailed scrolls, not over the top, but definitely making a statement. And we know they're chocolate pots because the handle is on the side, as opposed to a teapot where the handle would have been on the opposite side of the article to the spout. That's what I think silver is about. But of course it is all a matter of taste. I mean, there's some beautifully decorated pieces, highly skilled, but that is my style. Now, silver itself is a beautiful metal with some amazing properties that have ensured its continuous use by man from the 3rd millennium BC. And simple extraction methods from ores, as well as from native silver, have made it fairly readily available. Okay, now a bit of a technophobe here. The picture on the left is of lead ore with silver in it. And this is from a mine in California, as you can see. And I just want to go forward to the next slide first. This is an example of native silver. So this is silver that can be extracted directly. And then on the right-hand side here is fine silver. And this is what the silver looks like when it's been extracted. It's molten. To cool it down, it's poured into a liquid, and depending on several other physical attributes, it forms a grain like this, or it can form a larger grain, and in fact, even funny, unusual shapes. Early rich deposits were found in Greece around Athens. And these deposits helped to finance new fleets and wars. And if you think about it, the fact that the silver enabled the Greeks to be so successful in beating their foes, it possibly saved civilization as we know it today, because the Greek civilization is the root of our civilization now. So it was very important, that silver, in that case. Other early deposits are found in Britain and in Iberia, although a lot of Britain's accumulated silver reserve was the result of international trading with the export of grain and silver, which they did a lot. Not silver, sorry. Export of grain and later wool. And these transactions were paid for in gold and silver bullion. So the Brits, or the English at that time, amassed a huge amount of silver. The discovery of the New World revealed the vast deposits of silver in Spanish America. And you can see from the map on the screen, most of the silver deposits are on the top left-hand side in what we know as Mexico today. And the Spanish haul was huge. It was shipped back to Spain to fund the coffers there, but a lot of it was diverted by Francis Drake and others. And because they amassed so much silver in Britain due to that, it caused the price to drop. But that's been its story throughout history. Huge new deposits were discovered in North America, Australia and Mexico during the 19th century. But it is Mexico that is one of the few countries still mining silver as silver, rather than the byproduct of copper or lead mining. And again, due to the vast quantities of silver readily available today, the bullion is at one of its lowest prices in a long time. However, last year, the silver price did start to rise, and the outlook for 2017 going forward looks set to continue this trend. Canada today is number 15 in the world of silver producing countries. And the many mines scattered countrywide from Nova Scotia right the way across the country to BC perhaps look set for a very rosy future. So perhaps you should buy a few shares now. Silver is one of the most malleable and ductile metals, and these qualities enable it to be used in very many different ways. Oh, by the way, that was Francis Drake. Sorry, I forgot about him. Silver is one of the most malleable and ductile metals, and it is these qualities that enable it to be used to make whatever the craftsman desires. There's almost nothing that it cannot be fashioned into. It can be beaten out into the thinnest of sheets and easily drawn into microscopically thin wire. And in fact, I've got a piece of metal here. This is silver. It's actually a troy ounce of silver. And that amount of silver can be drawn into a wire 40 miles long. So that shows you the extent that it can be maneuvered and manipulated. It's almost limitless in its workability, and it is able, once polished, to reflect light more than any other metal known to man. I might stand to be corrected there, because maybe now with all the space race and the new satellites, etc., they might possibly are new metals that are highly reflective, but generally speaking, it has been the most reflective material known to man. And it creates a magical effect, as you can see from this picture, when used on the domestic table, together with candelabra and flickering candles. What better way to show off your wealth? And this is, of course, what happened over the centuries. The merchants, the emerging middle class, wanted to show off their wealth, and what better way to do it than to have a dining table full of beautiful silver. A major property of silver that is well and truly exploited in modern times is the ability to conduct heat and electricity, making it an important material in the electronic industry. It is, for example, found as a component in electrodes or electric compounds. And I'm sure a lot of us have experience of that over the years. But it was traditionally the photographic industry that was the largest user. The metal itself is self-sterilizing, in that bacteria cannot live on its surface. And once this was realized, it was used for centuries for making medical instruments. And the picture here shows a little setup. So I don't know what they're for, I think to speculate. But in a nice little carrying case for the travels. And those sorts of things are in fact really silver has the advantage of being much lighter than other precious metals such as gold and platinum. And this has made it the preferred metal for larger items of plate. When I use the term plate, I don't mean plated. That was the term that was used for large items of silver or gold. It's a early term that said gold or plated silver. For example, a silver teapot that weighs 30 ounces silver then weighed 45 ounces in gold. It was made to exactly the same specifications. And then if you filled the teapot, well, from there on it came out quite a heavy difficult item. So there was great advantage in using silver for domestic use. Historically, the term goldsmith implies silversmith. And that's the term that I will use throughout the presentation today. An early definition of the requirements to become a good goldsmith can be found in this little quotation by Mr. Campbell in the London Tradesman of 1747. Well, you can read it. He has to be a good designer, have good taste in sculpture, conversant in alchemy, that is, in all properties of metals. He must know the various ways of assaying metals. This is in the original English. And distinguishing the real from the fictitious. Very important. He ought to be possessed of a solid judgment, as well as a mechanical hand and head. His education with respect to his business does not require to be very liberal. A plain English education will suffice. Designing is the chief part of his early study, previous to his apprenticeship. So in other words, he had to have some designing experience before he even became apprenticed to a master. good goldsmith has to be more than a good craftsman. He had to have financial skills when dealing with coins and bullion, and eventually the goldsmiths evolved into early bankers. And here we see a picture, a supposed view of the Bank of England 1695, but what it shows is the gold or silver, the goldsmith coming in, depositing specie. Specie, I didn't know this, means coins, means, so no paper notes involved, just purely coins. And of course, coins at this time was sterling silver standard. So when they acquired an amount of silver, they weren't going to use it immediately, they could deposit it. Other essentials to be a good goldsmith included a good address, a reputation as a man of integrity and discretion. You had to have the right family connections, and a good marital, and be of good marital opportunity. And of course, you ought to have an access to customers as well. This drawing is of a mid-17th century workshop. Shows the different workstations, different tasks that the silversmiths there are demonstrating. But in the background, there actually is a counter where the public would come to. So it was a combination of a retail outlet as well as a workshop. And you'll see that the three men there are fashionably dressed. They had to be presentable. Not only were they working, but they had to deal with clients as well. So they couldn't be too shabby. And this gives an indication of the status of a goldsmith, which at the time was considerable. They were highly respected. They were highly skilled, highly respected. Certain skills, such as gilding and engraving, are carried out by specialists. Planishing and engraving were the province of women, generally the wives or widows of goldsmiths. Women also made small wares in silver and some jewellery. Very often, groups of subcontractors that knew each other well would get together. If a big order came in from an estate to do, let's say, tableware for 40 or 50 people by a certain time, you had to call on all hands on deck to execute that order, and it had to be delivered on time. So they combined together to get that order out. They helped one another out, and that was apparently quite common. Pure silver, like pure gold, is too soft for everyday use, and it is necessary to harden it by making an alloy, usually with copper. And in England, this alloy consists of 92.5% silver and 7.5% copper. And this was the legal standard for sterling silver, with only one exception in the last 700, well, no, that's not true, strictly true. Where we're talking from now, since 1300, there's only been one exception, which I will mention a little later. So early goldsmiths need to make the alloy into workable sheet, and this was done by laboriously hammering the ingot, as you see here, into sheet of suitable thickness to enable it to be formed into various wares. Now this did not require a lot of skill, just brute force and a sledgehammer. Later on in time, the development of the rolling mill made this easier, because then you could feed your silver in once you had it a little bit thinner than that, and hand turn, and the sheet ran through the roller and you kept repeating this. As it came out the one side, you brought it back, put it through again, until you gradually got it right down to the thickness that you required. But at this time, it was just jolly hard work. And you'll see this in this picture of a workshop dating from about 1700. Down in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see the men literally beating the metal to death, just about. And hanging up on the wall above, over the fire, various implements, ladles, tongs for holding the hot bowls and for pouring, some silversmithing hammers. These were the tools of the trade. The next stage was to cut appropriately sized round pieces of metal from the sheet and then raising them to hollow shapes by careful hammering on the sinking block or metal stake. The stakes were made of iron or steel, and that's exactly what's happening here. He's hammering a piece of silver on a metal stake. In order to prevent damage or scratching of the silver, a special hammer was used for this process that was devoid of sharp edges. As the metal worked, it became more and more springy and had to be annealed. And this was a process of heating and cooling that eventually restored the metal back to its original condition. Great skill and patience was needed in some of these processes. Here you'll see they're doing this with what is going to be the rim, or the foot actually, I think in this case, of a vessel. And they planished each section, and as they moved around, they overlapped the new section with the old one until they had covered the whole piece of metal. The broad-faced polished hammer gave the amazing luster to silver. And it also gradually smoothed out any irregularities on the surface. And when this had been completed, additional parts, such as spouts, handles, finials, or feet, would then be cast in moulds and soldered onto the body of the silver solder. Of silver with silver solder. And you have to understand that the silver solder had to have a lower melting point than the body of the item itself, because it was no good putting on soldering something too hot and then you melt your original piece. So the silver solders were specific and at a specific temperature. There were many different this is another example of planishing on a mushroom-shaped stake, and we have something a little bit similar on the table there if you would like to have a look later, and Jeff will explain the use of those. And here we just have a picture that the item would be polished, given the final polish, with a polishing mop. That's a soft cloth mop. It's layers and layers of cotton, I think, with a hole through the middle, fixed onto a stake, and then rotated to polish the item. And in this case, they are trimming the sides of it so that the centre is raised. Then you can just polish specific areas as you need. There were many different techniques used to decorate the finished piece, such as engraving, chasing, as you can see this fine example on the left-hand side. The bowl on the right is an example of cut card work from about 1715. And in this case, once the vessel is finished, a thin sheet of silver is cut into various shapes, leaves, or whatever decoration they wish to apply, and then that was soldered again onto the top of the finished article. The picture on the left shows a very fine example of repoussé work, London, around about 1664. And I think if you look at the detail of this, repoussé work, they pushed the design from the back of the piece, so it would have been pushed out from behind that rim. And if you look at the detail and the skill there, and that was in 1664, all done by hand, very little machinery involved in silversmithing at all. The skills were high. And then on the right-hand side, we've got a picture of an engraved tankard with a lid from about 1670. And at this time, drinking vessels had lids. It's another clue to the period that it was possibly made. And then a little later, of course, the beer cans or mugs didn't have a lid. On the left here, we see bright cup decoration from 1792. This was very typical of the Georgian period. It's a type of engraving, but it is cut in such a way that the surfaces that are cut out are flat and reflect the light. We've got an example here. It's very delicate and very attractive. On the right-hand side, there's a card case, which is chased in high relief, but the body itself is engine turned. And this dates from about 1850, Birmingham, and this was a very popular form of decoration in the Victorian period, this engine turned effect. And they could produce all sorts of different patterns. Again, we have 2 or 3 pieces on the table there. They are actually enamelled in this case, but it gives you an idea of the type of turning. And this is later, mid-19th century, machines start to become involved now. Let's see if there's any more. No. Okay. In 1300, the King's Mark was introduced and stamped onto the articles once it was assayed to prove its quality. And the quality was the sterling standard. As you remember, 92.5% silver and 7.5% copper. It had to be precise. The King's Mark here is a crowned leopard. Well, actually it's a lion, but because French was very fashionable at this time, amongst the educated classes, they referred to it as a leopard. In 1327, so this was 1300, 27 years later, Edward III bestowed the right to conduct and enforce the assay laws to the Worshipful Company of Goldsmiths, who carried out this task at their hall, the Goldsmiths' Hall in London, hence the term hallmark. So this is where it started. 14th century, we start to develop the hallmark system. A few years later, the power of touch was given to the mayors of all cities and boroughs. The maker's mark became compulsory, and in 1478, the Master of Touch was elected annually, and that's where you get the change of the letter every year, because the master changed, so the date letter changed. And it went through cycles of the alphabet, not necessarily complete alphabet. Sometimes 1 or 2 letters were omitted, but generally, and then once they'd got to the end of the alphabet, they would change the style of the letter or the style of the cartouche, so that you could then quickly identify what they were. Just going back to the maker's marks becoming compulsory, there were pictorial marks at that stage. It would be a sun, a picture of a sun or a moon or stars, or a picture of some sort, because most of the population at that time were illiterate. So they couldn't read initials or names, and this was the only way that you can convey that sort of information to them. London, and this is specifically London, and for a long time London was really the main centre for assaying silver. The date changed each year in May. That's why in some of the silver hallmark books, it doesn't give a year, 1950, well, we'll go back a bit further, 1650, for example. It could say 1650/51, and that's because you didn't know if it had been assayed between May and December or January to April the next year. That's why you see those two figures there. It changed in May in London because that was St Dunstan's Day. Now St Dunstan was a monk who was a very talented goldsmith. And he became the patron saint of goldsmiths, and his effigy is still to this day in Goldsmiths' Hall in London. Now, in 1544, the Lion Passant Guardant stamp was introduced by the Goldsmiths Company themselves to establish their own guarantee of quality, thereby replacing the leopard's head as the sterling mark. And if you look at the picture here, we've got this very charming little lion walking along, but he's facing you and he's waving. And that was the early mark that they brought in. So it was a lion, passant, walking, Guardant looking at you, and it's important to remember that. And the poor old leopard mark eventually evolved into the town mark for London. Now from 1697, slide here, I think. No, all right. From 1697 to 1720, the Britannia silver standard was introduced. Now this is not to be confused with Britannia metal, which doesn't have any silver in it at all and is something totally different, and we will talk about it later. So this is a new standard of fineness. It's more fine than sterling silver, in as much as it is now 95.8% silver. Sterling was 92.5%. And therefore, of course, it only has 4.2% of copper. And this was introduced to try and counteract the clipping of the coins, because the coins were sterling. So unscrupulous dealers would clip off bits and pieces of the coinage until it was effectively debased. And then they would collect together all their bits and pieces of silver, and they would even make their own coins. So you can imagine this was a very serious offence. In fact, I think I read somewhere that it was actually punishable by death if you were caught, because it was just a huge scam. So they kept the coinage at sterling silver, but they raised the fineness of silver that was used by the goldsmiths to the Britannia standard. And to show that standard, they now used, instead of the little lion walking along, we now have what they called a lion erased. It's a heraldic term, and it means that the fur around his neck is quite shaggy. And they added the figure of Britannia, or Britannia silver. So those two marks were now part of the hallmark system. Now by 1738, presumably the population was a little more educated, and it was stipulated that the marks could be the maker's initials only. No more pictures. Now it was initials. In 1784 to 1890, there was a duty imposed on silver, the amount of 6pence per ounce, which at that time was quite heavy. And to show that you had paid that, a profile of the monarch's head was also stamped onto the silver. So now you had 5 marks on your hallmark. The sterling mark, the town mark, the date stamp, maker's initials, and in this period from 1784 to 1890, you had the duty mark, the monarch's head. Now, if you were a goldsmith in France and you wanted to sell some of your products in England, from 1842 you had to have an import mark stamped on your item. And the mark varied from centre to centre. We've got here London, Birmingham, Sheffield and Edinburgh. So that meant that once your piece of silver landed in England, you then had to get it to the assay office, and you had to have it stamped, then you had to get it back, and then only then could you sell it. It wasn't that you couldn't take silver in, but you were not allowed to sell it. And in actual fact, we had an instance in our business just recently where we sold a piece of silver to a man living in Scotland. And I immediately thought, are we able to do that? But in actual fact, he bought it from us in Canada, and then we shipped it over. So it wasn't actually sold in the UK, and that is permissible. Now, as you can see here, for special occasions there were additional marks that were put onto the silver. The first 2, the Jubilee and the Coronation, were compulsory marks. Thereafter, the Jubilee mark from 1977 and the following ones were optional. You, as a silversmith, did not have to have that put onto your silver if you did not wish. But you had to specify, of course, when you sent it to the assay office. But in all fairness, I think historically those marks have proved to be very advantageous. And I can't think of, in a retail situation, why you wouldn't want those on there. But that was the story. Now, in 1973, they brought in a new Hallmarking Act, which now rationalised the hallmarking system. Because up until now, different assay offices had different date marks for the same year, and now this was all structured so that every office was using the same cycle at the same time. So there were no anomalies. How are we doing for time? Then, of course, the EU reared its ugly head, still contentious today, and they said, you have to have the marks that we want on your silver. And the compulsory marks were, you had to have the maker's initials, well that's okay, they did that anyway. You had to have the town mark, that was fine. But what was different was that you had to have the fineness of the silver represented by numerals. So that, and the whole point of this was it then covered the European marks as well as the British ones. So those 3 became compulsory, but the Brits still maintained the option to have their lions and anything else that was legal to put on there. And what actually happened at the assay office was that they automatically put everything on. If you didn't want the additional British marks, you had to elect to not have them put on. So that calmed everybody down a little bit because they still had their traditional hallmarks if they wanted them. Okay, I'm just going to skip quickly now. There were provincial assay offices eventually, other than just London. Because if you can imagine, if you, for example, were a silversmith in York, you had to get your silverware down to London to have it assayed. Now this was an arduous journey, certainly wasn't comfortable, the roads were terrible, there was a high risk that a highwayman would hold you up and take all your silver. So it was very precarious. So Parliament was eventually persuaded that there should be other assay offices around the country, but a lot of them closed down, in some cases relatively quickly, some others in the 60s. And these, you can see the marks here for the particular ones. Generally, they were taken from the city crest. So Exeter, the 3 towers there was part of the city crest. Chester, the wheat sheaves with the sword erect. So on and so forth. Okay, so now, just to summarise, you can see here the 5 marks. You've got your maker's mark on the left-hand side. That, in this case, was Paul Storr, very famous silversmith. Your lion, your crowned leopard, the date letter, and in this period of time, there had to be a duty mark on there. And that was how they appeared on the piece of silver. Is that it? Okay, just a brief summary. The other things that we do have to think about, of course, are Scottish silver. They've always been independent, so they had a slightly different system. The Edinburgh Silver Standard was established in 1457, so early, and the town mark added in 1485. The thistle, which was to become the standard mark for sterling in Scotland, was introduced in 1759, and it was found on all Edinburgh silver until 1975, and then the mark that was imposed was the lion rampant. I thought, did we not have a picture of that? Yeah. Okay, the bottom right-hand corner, lion rampant, and the thistle mark. We'll just go back one more because this is actually Glasgow. This would be the Edinburgh mark. Then the next largest assay office in Scotland was Glasgow, established in 1819. Now they did the reverse. They used the lion rampant in 1819, and it was only in 1914 that the thistle was added, and then they kept both of them. But that office closed finally in 1964. The town mark is interesting. It's a tree with a bird sitting on the top. We haven't got a terribly clear picture of this, I do apologise. But there was a bell hanging from one of the branches on the tree, and then across the bottom of the tree was a fish, a salmon, with a ring in its mouth. And I haven't researched sufficiently to find actually the meaning of that. I don't think that that was taken from the city crest, but I stand to be corrected. If I find out, I'll let you know. Irish silver. There were highly skilled, well-established Irish silversmiths from very early times. They have always made beautiful silver. But in 1637, the Dublin office was established, and these 2 marks appeared, the crowned harp, and now a picture of Hibernia. And this is where you have to be careful, because if you look at the Britannia mark, the mark of Britannia, and Hibernia, they are very, very similar. But of course, Hibernia will always have the harp with it as well. But if you go into the silver hallmarking books and you put those 2 images close together, there are differences, but at a quick glance, that could be Britannia. So that just is something to be aware of. Okay, today there are only 4 assay offices in Great Britain. Birmingham, Edinburgh, London and Sheffield. So everything has to go to those offices. And you'll see here the Sheffield mark is a rose. Originally it was a crown, but I think it was in 1975 that was changed to a rose. And finally, the last stamp, the modern stamp, is a fair trade stamp. And that's self-explanatory. You obviously use non-conflict materials, environmentally aware materials. It's a vogue, it's not a vogue, that's unfair. It's a trend today to show that you are environmentally conscious. So that is a new mark that you now find on silver. Not in my time, but there it is. I just want to pop back, if I can, just very quickly, finally. Now, this really is finally now. I'm sure we're all quite tired. If you look here, the special occasion marks, you'll see that there was a special mark for the millennium, and that was applied during the years 1999 to 2000. Now, Jeff, my husband, has a British hallmark, and we've got just a couple of little pieces there. We had some pieces hallmarked, well, many pieces actually, but they were all sold, that were hallmarked with the millennium mark on, because we felt that this was something special. It was an attractive reason for people to buy that piece of silver, and if you want to see the mark, you can see them there. I'm going to close there. It's about half of what I needed to say. I've explained this to Ken. It's a huge subject to fit into such a small amount of time. And we still have to look at American marks, Canadian marks, European marks. There's so many things that we can still talk about. Fakes and forgeries, caring for your silver. And as I say, if you're all happy, we might